The rise of China is reshaping the world. What was a starving nation, ravaged by civil war and revolution, has become a global superpower.
The hunger for a better life was so huge that they were willing to take enormous risks and make enormous sacrifices.
The whole atmosphere at that time was this kind of hope.
They try to erase the history, erase human memories, so Chinese people cannot know their own past.
China is a haunted house. There were all these weeping ghosts in the air from all these past tragedies and disasters.
There's a perfect marriage of communism and capitalism when they matched together and created something wow.
China is not good at soft power. Plenty of hard power. But in terms of soft power, not so good.
This is exactly why the government cannot have this generation in their pockets, because they don't understand us at all.
The only way that you can say that a return to the motherland is natural is to completely disregard history.
The rise of China didn't happen overnight. Its roots reach deep into the past. And if we want to understand what's happening now, we need to dig down into the foundations of the China century. The story of China's rise is inseparable from the challenge it poses to the American-led world order. The relationship between the United States and China has become the defining contest of the 21st century. It's a relationship with a long history, forged in an era of shifting alliances, opportunity, and betrayal. The world's greatest rivalry began as a love triangle. In 1969, there were two Chinas. On Taiwan was nationalist China, exiled to the island after losing the Chinese Civil War, and ruled by the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. Nationalist China had been the object of American affections since World War II, backed up by American ideals, money, and firepower.
The United States dreamed of a democratic China, a Christian China, to project its own image onto. Of course, this had to do with America's long-standing zeal to convert and to spread its own values and ideas, democracy, freedom, liberty.
Free China, the Americans had promised, would one day reclaim the mainland. Her guns pointed the way home. Over the Taiwan Strait was Communist China, led by the great helmsman, Mao Zedong. The People's Republic had been in the deep freeze with America since Mao swept to power in 1949 and lined up with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In 1969, Red China was in turmoil. The Cultural Revolution, Mao's violent campaign for ideological purity, terrorized the nation. Any failure to conform was punished.
Everybody was scared. Everybody was in a state of panic and uncertainty. I was fortunate enough not have lived through that period of time, but my parents' generation did. The whole country was white and blue. I remember my mom told me, all she had in her closet was a couple of white shirts and blue pants, and then just military uniforms. There's nothing else. The whole nation was just like that. People who were considered of having impure thoughts were either forced to confess or murdered or pushed to suicide. Millions of families were ruined. The whole nation was impoverished and in a state of near paralysis.
As Red China was racked from within, tensions with their Soviet comrades reached crisis point. The Chinese Communist Party had split with the Soviet leadership in 1959 over ideological differences. A decade later, Moscow and Beijing were on the brink of war. The United States was having its own cultural revolution. 1969 was the era of Woodstock and race riots, moon landings and mass murder, and protests against America's role in Vietnam. With China supporting the Communist North, Vietnam had become a costly and intractable proxy battle in America's Cold War. New President Richard Nixon saw a chance for the US to break free by thawing its 20-year freeze in relations with Red China.
Nixon understands that China is an important key to getting the United States out of Vietnam. Peace with honor. At the same time, there was also finally an understanding that the Sino-Soviet split, the split between Russia and China, was real, and that the Soviet Union was threatening China, in fact, threatening China with nuclear destruction. Nixon had this idea of, we really need to recognize China as a power, but we also need to think of the potential for leveraging China against our main enemy, which is the Soviet Union.
Nixon engaged his national security advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, to reach out to Beijing about a potential future visit. It had to be in secret. Both men understood the sensitivity of going cold on Taiwan and getting into bed with Chairman Mao. An unlikely intermediary would pave the way. Ping pong.
Ping-pong diplomacy began in April with a surprise invitation to an American table tennis team to visit China. Other teams followed, and just as significant as the welcome given to them all was the freedom accorded to journalists and cameramen who accompanied them. It was as though the Chinese authorities suddenly wanted the world to see their country through fresh eyes.
The American ping-pong delegation. The group is, there's sort of bell-bottom wearing hippies, there's guys who are smoking dope all the time. And they go to China and they're welcomed massively by the Chinese, because the Chinese also need a way to sell this to their people. The Chinese media frames the American arrival in Beijing as a supplicant to the Great China. It's a throwback in a way to how foreign dignitaries were made to feel when they came to Beijing to meet the emperor. They basically allow the Americans to win a couple of games, but then beat them in the end. The Chinese clearly are much better. And so the Chinese are happy because it looks like the Americans from this little country in the West are coming to China to plead for better relations. And in the United States, it becomes this just massive media frenzy.
Hot on the heels of the ping pong team came Dr. Kissinger's secret trip. There is, of course, no photographic record of the visit. What we do know is that his meeting with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was successful because just days later, President Nixon announced live to the world he'd been invited to Red China.
An invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure. I want to put our policy in the clearest possible context. Our action in seeking a new relationship with the People's Republic of China will not be at the expense of our old friends.
America's most important old friends were Taiwan, and of course they felt deeply betrayed by what had happened, and not only what had happened, but how it happened, because they had no notice of it. Effectively, the US was giving up recognition of Taiwan, and of course there's nothing that Taiwan can do except adapt as best they can and hopefully pull the US back into their orbit.
Nixon's visit to Beijing in February 1972, at the invitation of Premier Zhou Enlai, revived America's missionary zeal for China.
I think the United States did not have the illusion of the nationalists reclaiming the mainland at that time, or long before that. Visiting Beijing was seen as a necessary move to show the world that the United States had not lost its way. It would still be able to carry out its idealistic vision to bring about 1/4 of humanity into the so-called family of nations.
What is most important is that we have an open world. As we look at this wall, we do not want walls of any kind between peoples. And I think one of the...
Behind the sightseeing and the photo ops, Chairman Mao and the nation he'd plunged into chaos were in declining health. For the nation at least, Nixon's visit was a lifeline.
China at the time was on the brink of collapse. It was a reflection of really Mao's failure to modernize China. It needed the United States to help China improve its economic and political well-being. China wanted to catch up with the rest of the world, so America was very important.
The opening of relations set China on a course for a new kind of revolution. But Mao would not be part of it. He died in 1976. Mao's death cleared the way for a more pragmatic helmsman. Deng Xiaoping hitched his nation's fortunes to the American wagon and proclaimed his mission to save China by studying the West. His US tour in 1979, including a visit to a Texas rodeo, sealed the deal on a new era of rapturous engagement between the superpower and its protege.
It was a signal, obviously, to Americans. Americans just love that kind of stuff. that China wants to be America's friend, but it was also a signal back to China that the Chinese people could expand the universe. They could embrace American culture.
That's how we learned about America, from the sitcoms and Hollywood films. Everybody was just so gorgeous, you know, blue eyes, blonde hair, and all that, very tall, sharp features. That's how we learned about American people. And I learned about what middle-class American lives were like from, I think, a very popular sitcom at the time. It's called Growing Pains. The children were free to say whatever came to their minds, and there was no consequences when they talked back to their parents. You know, it's just like really drawn to that kind of life. America was really the shining city up on a hill. Not just to, you know, very impoverished Chinese peasants, but to intellectuals, officials in the elite circle. It's really a model to be emulated, especially economically, if, you know, not politically.
In Shenzhen, employees have to meet contracts. Unlike the rest of China, they don't have the security of lifelong employment, but their pay is double and triple that of workers elsewhere. The new policy is for some people to get rich before others.
Deng's mantra was reform and opening up. He told his party, we must admit that we are backwards and explore new ways to catch up with the West. A rush of trade and travel between the two countries followed.
You have Americans going to China to set up automobile manufacturing plants. You have Americans spending tens of millions of dollars to try to help the Chinese improve their mining. You have a deep engagement on the scientific and medical professions, where Chinese by the thousands are brought to the United States to be educated at major American universities, with the Chinese being viewed in the United States as willing recipients of American largesse, American capital, and American ideas.
I started my university in 1986 in Beijing. I remember in the university bookshop, there was a series of translated Western classics. People were queuing up to buy those books. It's like today's people queuing up to buy the latest model of iPhone. You could see the ideas begin to be shifted in the media, talking about how we should work hard and spend hard to enjoy life. Traditionally, Chinese people were really good at saving, not spending.
While America's Cold War with the Soviets ground on, China was trading Marxism for markets.
As politics are systematically wound down, new slogans are appearing. Their message is sometimes not at all what Mao had in mind. But if Coca-Cola is part of the price of Western technology, then let the peasants drink Coke.
As part of forging official relations in 1979, President Carter had granted China most favored nation trading status, according China the unfettered access to the US market, usually reserved for Western democratic allies.
And when the most favored nation treaty was being debated, the debate was framed with this idea that through trade and engagement with China, we will help China to reform its economy into a capitalist economy, which will then naturally, through some type of natural process of alchemy, turn China into a democracy, which is kind of, from the perspective of today, it seems wacky, but it had a lot of traction at the time, simply because Americans believed so deeply that this was our next great place that we could conquer.
Within China, as the economy modernized, there was a growing push for political change. to match the economic reforms.
You know, the government suppress news, suppress the truth. Of course, we are struggling for democracy, for science, for law.
It was a push that culminated in nationwide demonstrations in the spring of 1989. The largest of them in Beijing's Tiananmen Square.
The whole atmosphere at that time was this kind of hope that with our participation, with our push, the government would do something, and there was this kind of optimism, actually, to have our input into the political and economic reform process. So almost every student at that time was somehow involved.
The protests coincided with a visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to Beijing. There to cover this historic summit, Chinese and international media turned their cameras on the protests. The world was watching.
I was far from the power center, so I was far from the protests. But I do remember being glued to TV on a daily basis, just like the rest of the country. You know, this amazing thing actually happened in China. For my generation, we had never seen anything like that before. People actually taking to the streets, right, to call for democracy, transparency, accountability. Nothing about overthrowing the government. Everything was about trying to have a better China, a better future.
You have 500,000 people on Tiananmen Square. You have this captivating story in the United States about the Chinese people finally, after 10+ years of influence from the United States, are going to throw off the cloak of communism and embrace freedom. You have the goddess of democracy, which is sort of a Statue of Liberty look-alike, coming onto Tiananmen Square to kind of herald in the changes.
The goddess had spoken too soon. In the early hours of June 4th, the dream of democracy she embodied was crushed under the tracks of a tank.
Tanks are rolling in down the main thoroughfare towards Tiananmen Square. There's sporadic shooting, automatic weapons opened up, people were diving for cover. We can spot ambulances going in a ferry-like fashion, sirens blaring, taking people, taking bodies, taking injured people.
Hundreds, perhaps thousands of peaceful protesters were killed in the Tiananmen Square massacre by order of their own government. It was a turning point in China's rise. Later that year, the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the end of the Cold War. Some said it was the end of history, that the last remaining challenger to the US-led world order had been toppled. But history had started over in Beijing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Bush's reaction to the crackdown was, to say the least, soft. He didn't really criticize the Chinese very strenuously.
This is not the time for an emotional response, but for a reasoned, careful action that takes into account both our long-term interests and recognition of a complex internal situation in China.
I was, at the time, in China. I just covered the Tiananmen Square crackdown. And on the ground, it was fairly straightforward. The military was called into the city to kill unarmed protesters, and they did their job. It was not complicated, and it should have been condemned vociferously from all the nations of the world. And as the leader of the free world at the time, Bush really set the tone.
Now is the time to look beyond the moment to important and enduring aspects of this vital relationship for the United States.
Eager to safeguard economic relations, Bush imposed only limited sanctions on military trade and did not revoke China's most favored nation trading status. To many Americans who saw the violence on TV, the measures were inadequate. In China, the clampdown on dissent continued. Hundreds of students and dissidents were imprisoned. Many were beaten, some executed.
Today, the first death sentences passed in Beijing were handed out to these 8 men. The death penalty here is carried out by a single bullet in the back of the head.
State media portrayed the army as peacekeepers and martyrs.
The Children's Brigade members presented a wreath as a way of expressing their grief for the PLA soldiers who had lost their lives in the square.
What I saw was what was portrayed as student protesters burning army vehicles, burning the soldiers. Those were the images we saw on TV, not the tanks running over the students, not that.
Aging leader Deng Xiaoping blamed the protests on the corrupting influence of the West and the decline of ideological fervour among the masses.
The official verdict of 1989 from Deng was that it was a counter-revolutionary riot stirred up by foreign elements. Of course, it wasn't. It was a totally indigenous movement. It was not only an existential threat to Communist Party rule in China, it was also a threat to Deng himself, to his legacy, and more seriously, to his position in command of the party. So in some respects, he made a slight self-criticism after this. He admitted basically that they'd neglected politics in favour of economic reform, that they hadn't taught young people about the glories of the Communist Party and its great history.
To rally the Chinese youth around a renewed sense of national pride, the government instituted a program of patriotic education starting in kindergarten, focused on China's history of struggle against foreign imperialism and bullying.
The party definitely tried to beef up education of the party's history and centuries of humiliation, all the sacrifices previous generations had made in order to have a unified China, peaceful China.
When the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they arrived in Beijing as winners, as victors. But what happened in the 90s, they flipped the narrative to make China the victim. Because there was a rich vein of history to draw on, of Chinese being humiliated, the country being carved up, of foreigners getting their way and the like. They re-emphasised how foreigners, even then, that is in the mid-90s, were trying to keep the Chinese people down just as they had for the previous 100 years. So they went from victor to victim. And it was a very powerful narrative because almost anything after that can be construed as a conspiracy against China. Any criticism of China thus was unfair, unjust, and just a replay of what devious, nasty foreigners had done to China in the centuries past.
The government's campaign to ramp up nationalism coincided with a supercharged commitment to economic growth. It was good timing. As the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, China was the last remaining communist power. But the old ideology of socialism had lost its ability to rally the masses. Getting rich and getting even were the new drivers of national ambition.
It's purposeful for the government to keep everybody very busy with a hope to be richer and to be more successful. So they can't focus on, for example, like a human rights issue. Many Chinese are not interested because they are very preoccupied with their own individual livelihood.
As China's leaders smothered politics with progress, new US President Bill Clinton launched a counter-crusade.
Clinton really pushes on the China issue, and he accuses Bush of coddling the butchers of Beijing, and he comes into office linking human rights and China's progress on human rights to trade relations with America.
We have a right to ask a country that has a $15 billion trade surplus with us to observe basic human rights while building market strength.
As president, Clinton broke with over a decade of US policy by making China's most favored nation trading status dependent on China improving its human rights record, including an end to religious persecution in Tibet and the release of all political prisoners who'd protested in 1989. In March 1994, Clinton dispatched his Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, to Beijing to inform the Chinese Premier Li Peng of the new terms of trade.
You can be sure that human rights will be right on the top of my agenda when I get to Beijing.
The Warren Christopher trip is really a turning point in US-China relations. Warren Christopher meets Li Peng, and Li Peng does more than lecture him. He really brutalizes him.
His meeting with Li Peng probably was the hardest meeting Christopher ever had in his life. That whole meeting turned into a harangue on Li Peng's part. He basically dared Christopher.
Li Peng calls their bluff. He says, okay, you can do that. If you do that, you will lose your big share of the China market.
From China's perspective, what are you? Why are you here pointing fingers at us? Our system is a party-led system. You knew from the very beginning that we're different systems, so you should respect our system. This was China's own sovereignty. You know, that was not to be interfered, meddled with.
Pursuing this human rights policy with China, Clinton really had this belief that he was holding all the cards, but the reality was he was holding none. As Deng Xiaoping said, China had really just become too big a piece of meat. David Rothkopf, who at the time was at the Treasury Department, talked about the Clinton administration policies as holding a gun to your own head. The economic attraction of the Chinese market was so great that America could only really trade with it and really had to put human rights off on the side and pursue this economic engagement. And that would then become the new holy grail that we would use to transform China into a better country.
Clinton's new policy of economic engagement pleased the American business lobby, but prominent liberals in his own administration, including Californian Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, were not convinced.
There are those who say that economic reform will lead to political reform. Well, not if it isn't allowed to. And I disagree with Bob, the Prime Minister, the Honorable Prime Minister, when he says that the rule of law is moving forward. There's so far to go on the rule of law, and it has to be the rule of law with respect for individual rights.
Put yourself into the minds, if you can for a moment, of the Chinese people, not just the Chinese leadership. Now just try and do it. I've tried to do it when I've been there. I've listened to them. They look at the West and they look at the historical record of brutality, pillage, rape, alienation of their rights, which was inflicted on them for over a century by the West. They look at America, they see aspects of America which they find appalling in terms of human rights. The fact that you legislators in the United States haven't got the guts to stand up to the gun lobby. I'm simply asking you...
Mr. Prime Minister, we will not accept that albatross.
Taking up his point, if China were to say, look, because of your gun policy or because of your policy towards the number of people that you have locked up in prisons that we would say are political prisoners, we are now going to use those elements to shape our trading policy with you. Would you accept a similar judgment from China?
First of all, we are all signatories to the International Declaration on Human Rights. What we're talking about in China is freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of the press.
That's some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's what we're talking. We're not talking about a democratic form of government. That's for the Chinese people to decide.
There was, of course, no mechanism through which the Chinese people could choose their government. Meanwhile, over the Taiwan Strait, America's old flame had abandoned its mission to reclaim the mainland and was instead preparing for a coming-out party, its first democratic presidential elections.
Taiwan had transformed itself from a tight little authoritarian nation-state into a vibrant democracy with some of the freest press in Asia. And in fact, Taiwan had actually become the China that we hoped China would become. And the Chinese on the mainland, they looked at Taiwan, of course, as part of their territory. And so in Taiwan, you have its first open, free, and fair election, and the election of Li Denghui, who actually believes that Taiwan should be independent of China. And the Chinese were extremely unhappy with his election, so much so that they fired missiles to try to pressure Taiwanese voters not to elect this guy president.
In August 1995, China launched a campaign of intimidation against Taiwan, which it regards as a renegade province, in what became known as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. In the first and second crises in the 1950s, America had defended Taiwan against its Cold War enemy, Red China. But since the forging of relations with China in 1979, the US had maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan question.
The United States did not promise to come to the aid of Taiwan in order not to encourage Taiwan to declare independence unilaterally. But the United States never said it would not intervene so as to deter China from taking unilateral actions against Taiwan. This was to keep both sides guessing how the United States could react in a crisis.
For the Clinton administration, the third Taiwan Strait crisis demanded a response.
The US Navy sailed an entire carrier battle group and an amphibious task group between Taiwan and the mainland, which was hugely threatening to the Chinese.
America's intervention forced a humiliating backdown from the Chinese. Their navy at that time was no match for the American war machine.
The lesson that China took from this event was that when push comes to shove, the Americans actually might defend Taiwan from China. It taught the Clinton administration and subsequent American administrations how serious China is about retaking Taiwan.
In the White House, there were some people who saw China as a rising threat, as a long-term competitor. There were others who saw the same threat but saw a different solution and saw that by showing them that they couldn't compete militarily and simultaneously offering them this wonderful economic partnership, it would convince China to rise as an economic player rather than as a military player. sort of like a mainland Asian version of Japan rather than a rival to the US.
In China, too, there was division. Despite the straining of relations, the appeal of American investment, trade, and education remained strong.
China at the time was still poor, and there was still this huge desire for better life. At that time, I already got full scholarship from New York University to pursue my graduate study in journalism. I was about to go to America, and then this bombing happened.
In May 1999, a US bomber on a NATO strike mission destroyed what it believed was a Serbian arms cache in Belgrade. In fact, it was the Chinese embassy. 3 Chinese nationals were killed.
The reason given by the US government why the bombing took place was a bad map, basically bad information. It was definitely not intentional. No one in China believed it. Huge demonstrations against the US erupted throughout the country. A lot of students, especially college students, took to the streets, and they also protested outside the US consulate. I remember people throwing bottles, stones, in some cases, even homemade bombs outside the consulate. It was really, really intense. I did question my decision to go to America at the time because should I really go to the country that just killed my countrymen?
It was the 10-year anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests, where students from Beijing's universities had paraded a replica of the Statue of Liberty. Now, after a decade of patriotic education in a rising China, students from those same universities were burning American flags.
One of the comforting illusions that Americans told themselves at the time was this is all artificial, it's stoked by the Communist Party, you don't have to take it seriously, these are just fake protests. And people on the ground at the time pointed out, no, this is not fake, it's real. And it's coming from a pride that Chinese feel now that they feel is being dissed by the West, and that's no longer going to be acceptable.
One of the abiding fears of the Cold War had been that a miscalculation could be the spark that ignited global conflict. The bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade fanned the embers of America and China's growing rivalry. And then, on a cloudless September morning in 2001, the wind changed. The attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001 were compared to the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And just as Pearl Harbor drew America into the Pacific theater of World War II, so 9/11 plunged the US into the war on terror in the Middle East.
It's hard to remember now because 9/11 looms so large, but Chinese-US tensions were actually at an extraordinarily high pitch in 2001, before 9/11. This was the era of the transformation agenda in the Pentagon that was being pushed by Donald Rumsfeld, that was all about taking the American way of war to just a whole new level. And the Chinese very much believed that to be directed at them. And they probably weren't wrong about that, actually. The US didn't expect the war on terrorism. We became distracted by 9/11, but the Chinese were then not involved in Iraq, not involved in Afghanistan, not soaked up in all the counterterrorism stuff that we found ourselves doing so quickly after 9/11, and they were free to watch us, to learn from our mistakes, and also to invest in building their own capabilities. And of course, this was the period in which China was entering the World Trade Organization and getting dramatically better terms of trade than it had had at any time in the past, and its prosperity began to shoot up dramatically, even as the Americans were distracted doing other stuff.
The global war on terror brought home to the Chinese not American success, but American failure. Failure in Iraq, failure in Afghanistan, the forever war. And that played a huge role in this emerging conception in China that the United States is no longer this global superpower, but it's a significantly weakened power.
After 9/11 came a decade of disaster and ruin for America. The most expensive war in its history. Industrial decay and unemployment. And the global financial crisis. In 2001, the US economy accounted for about a third of global GDP. By the end of the decade, it was barely 1/5. China, meanwhile, enjoyed an era of triumph. The Beijing Olympics, moon missions and spacewalks, and the 60th anniversary of communist rule. China began the decade at roughly 3% of global GDP. By 2010, it was the world's second largest economy and the largest foreign holder of US debt. While America foreclosed on homeowners and bailed out its banks, China pumped almost $600 billion into housing and construction, saving many resource-exporting economies from the worst of the crash.
That really helped bolster the Chinese leadership's confidence in its own system. Look, the US-led Western economic system didn't work, right? Failed, causing the entire global economy to plunge into recession. And China was the savior. So it really provided opening for Beijing to double down on its state-led system and to start promoting Chinese model to the rest of the world.
American anxiety about a rising China threat was among the burdens inherited by the Obama administration in 2009. In response, they began to strategize a pivot to Asia.
The consensus within the Chinese Communist Party, when I was speaking to them in 2009 in Beijing, was that they didn't need to fight the US, they didn't need to have a rivalry. I think that did start to shift pretty heavily after the pivot. I don't think it was the fault of the pivot. It was partly that, but it was also China's growing progress that it was making in militarizing and taking control of the South China Sea.
Foreign military aircraft. This is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Leave immediately in order to avoid misjudgment.
China and Taiwan don't agree on much, but it was a map first put forward by Chiang Kai-shek in 1947 that forms the basis of China's territorial and military claims over the South China Sea. Claims that are contested by other Asia-Pacific nations and by the historical dominance of the US Navy. Around 2010, China's growing assertiveness in the region began to ring alarm bells.
The Chinese had been pushing the governments around the South China Sea to accept Chinese dominance of this 1 million square mile waterway. China has basically claimed the whole thing.
Since 2013, China has constructed over 3,000 acres of artificial islands in the South China Sea, including ports, radar installations, ammunition stores, and airstrips. The Chinese government insists it's merely defending its sovereign territory and national interests.
60% of the world trade towards East Asia go through this area. And for China, about 80% of energy supply to China pass through the South China Sea. Also, the issue of Taiwan looms large. If there were some military clashes over Taiwan, the South China Sea could be of very high strategic value.
This issue of Taiwan, it's the unanswered question, it's the unfinished war. It's an issue that, above and beyond the other ideological issues, could be the centerpiece of the relationship in the future, a really dangerous part of the relationship in the future going forward.
The growing strain in US-China relations intensified with the rise to power of Xi Jinping, widely considered the most autocratic Chinese leader since Mao.
Xi Jinping becomes China's president in 2013. And his rise, with his much more militaristic view of China's relations with the world, with his desire to aggressively push back against any perceived slight against China, this begins a conversation around the world about this supercharged authoritarian country with a very successful economy, led by this hyper-nationalist leader who is intent on stamping China's image around the world as a global superpower. So the worries about a new Cold War with China started after Xi Jinping takes power.
The United States has long had this self-perception of its exceptionalism. The idea of the American century sustained US confidence in its ability and indeed entitlement to lead the world.
The US feels it's suffering from buyer's remorse. They opened their economy to China, they helped China into the world trading system, and of course all that's done is to allow China to sort of climb ahead of them.
Those issues have often been represented as a result of China's unfair trade practices, its stealing of intellectual properties, and so on and so forth. But Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton were the strongest promoters of free trade, of globalization. China obviously was caught in this wave of neoliberal reform. This was its opportunity to open up, to use its comparative advantage, cheap labor, for example, to revitalize its economy. This benefited transnational companies, but for the blue-collar workers in the West, they are the victims. Instead of pinning the blame on transnational capital or robots, it's much easier to say, yeah, we are screwed by China.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
In 2016, Donald Trump campaigned and won the presidency on a new China strategy of America first. The Trump administration turned its back on decades of engagement to declare China its adversary and called for the decoupling of their strategic partnership.
No matter how much you talk about decoupling between America and China, the trade links, the societal links are very deep, and this is not something that can be ripped asunder. The existential threat to this planet is not the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, it's global warming. And there's no way to deal with climate change without dealing with China. It's got huge environmental problems, and its political system is run by a guy who has recently declared himself president for life. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean much now, but once he begins to get old and he begins to totter, clearly China's going to be in for a very rough political transition, which could again manifest itself on the streets of China like it did in 1989. So China's political story is a story that is yet to be finished.
No one wants a war. But increasingly in the last few years, people have started to talk about that conflict as if it's inevitable. that China will fight Taiwan by 2025 and the US by 2035. And I think the problem that comes when people start to regard war as inevitable is that people stop trying to prevent it, and instead they start trying to position themselves to start it under the most favorable circumstances.
Is China really an enemy? I do not think so. There's still such a desire to come to the United States, learn about American way of life, sort of like what I did 20 years ago.
Hello.
There are a lot of things China have done that should be confronted. And it takes a more strategic planning to really both work with China and hold China accountable for some of their actions.
These countries need to sit down and need to calm down to realize that the world is bigger than any single country. The survival of a single country and the survival of the planet are actually the same thing now. This kind of a continuation of nationalist pride and the sense of all the problems coming from the outside, from foreigners, is really outdated. The 21st century is no longer the 19th century of the rule of the jungle. It needs to be a century for everybody.